Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, People, Process, and Parables, the recipe for business success. Today I have with us two special guests. Michael Halperin from FreeBridge and Paul Furiga from WordWrite Communications going to take us through what it means. We're going to go over a little bit of what's called EOS, and then Paul Furiga is going to tell us about why it's important to have a capital S story. Before we get started, I'll just have both of them introduce themselves real quick.
First of all, thanks, Eric, my friend, for doing this today and having both of us on. I really appreciate it. I guess to introduce myself, the people who know us best, clients of our company, WordWrite, would say that what I really am is a great storyteller. And that comes from more than 2 decades in journalism, where I figured it out one time. I wrote more than 10,000 stories and edited another 10,000. And at a brief period of time when I was in politics, which we won't talk about today. And for most of the last 20 years, I've been in the agency business, PR, marketing, digital, and that's really been like a afterburner booster rocket in terms of learning all about storytelling. And most importantly, as you mentioned, the capital S story, which I'll talk about in a few minutes.
Well, Paul, until we figure this out, why don't we, I'm going to just introduce what we're supposed to be talking about today. And we'll move forward. So most of you know that are on the line. See, most of you are clients in some manner of Center for Victory. And most of you use the PI and the Predictive Index software. You've heard of this inside of talent optimization, and what we're going to be talking about today. See that middle piece there, the diagnose, design, hire, and inspire. We'll be tickling that a little bit. That's what we're about is people. That's your people piece. But you have to have a business strategy and you have to have results. One of the things that has helped many companies, as Michael, when we get him back on the line, will help out with, is what do we want those business results to be and how do we get there? But the other piece that he's really going to be hammering down on as well is in that space of talent optimization. And then I've known Paul for even longer than Michael, and Paul has helped us years and years ago craft our story. And it's important to understand that story, especially nowadays when we're in COVID and people are working remotely. But I don't want to steal Paul's thunder, but I think we do have Michael back. Do we have you back, Michael, or are you on audio there? You good, Michael?
I am.
Okay, go ahead. Let's switch over to you. Just introduce yourself, and then you can take control of the screen there, my friend.
All righty. So I'm Michael Halperin, and I am an EOS Implementer. I have been working with companies in southwestern Pennsylvania and beyond, helping them to implement EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System. And I've been working with EOS since 2015. I first learned about it when I was running an IT services company here in southwestern Pennsylvania, and we were a very high growth company. We grew by 300% in 3 years. That's less than 20 full-time employees to over 75, which sounds like a great success story. The reality is it was pretty overwhelming. I had 150 things up in the air all at the same time. I was working 7 days a week, week after week, month after month after month, and just falling further behind. So a friend of mine introduced me to the book Traction, which is the Entrepreneurial Operating System, and I implemented EOS in my business. So for us, what it did is it dramatically improved our alignment, our focus, our traction. I got my life back. And when I left there back in 2017, kind of took a step back for what I thought I wanted to do with the next step of my career, and realized that I just have a passion for EOS. And so I decided to join the EOS worldwide community, and I became an EOS implementer. So that gives you a little bit of background of who I am and how I got here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump in here, and what I'm going to start with is by answering a couple of questions that I typically get answered. And the first one is, what is EOS? So simply put, the EOS is the entrepreneurial operating system. And the best way to describe what EOS is that there are some businesses out there that where the leaders of the business are getting everything they want out of their business. They're happy with revenue, they're happy with profitability, they're happy with growth. But those leaders have work-life balance because they're spending their time doing the things they love to do, the things they're great at, the things that really add value to the business. They're not just putting out fires. Their staff are fully engaged, working tightly together in using systems and processes that get work done with minimal noise, minimal wasted effort. They're creating a product or service that their customers love. So what I just described is what we refer to as a great business. And it's about 3 to 5% of all the businesses out there. The other 95% are varying degrees of not that, but trying to become that. EOS is a complete system of simple tools that helps a company make the journey from wherever they are towards building a great business. And I work with leadership teams to help them learn, adopt, and master the EOS tool set with the goal of getting them to self-sufficiency in that journey to become a great business. So second question I often get is, where did EOS come from? So the short answer to that is that EOS was created by a gentleman by the name of Gino Wickman. And everything that I'm talking about here is the result of Gino's work. To dig a layer deeper, there's really kind of two pieces to that story. The first is how it was created. And then the second is how Gino's knowledge of EOS has been shared across over 8,000 companies. So the first piece is how Gino came to create this. So you need to know a little bit about Gino. He is a lifelong entrepreneur, grew up in an entrepreneurial family, started his first venture when he was 21, took over the family business at 25, quickly realized it was a turnaround, led the turnaround, turned it into a great business, as I described, sold it, transitioned out, and then started working with other entrepreneurs. And as he did, he started to notice some patterns. He started to notice that there were this small number of great businesses, and he noticed that there were certain things that that 5% did that the 95% didn't do. He also noticed there were certain things that the 95% did that the 5% didn't do. So he started working with both, working with the great companies to help them understand why they were great, because a lot of times they didn't know, but he really focused a lot of his energy on helping the 95% make that journey to become great companies. And as he did, he noticed there were certain techniques and methods and tools that just seemed to work over and over again. So over a period of years, he refined those, pulled it into a very repeatable methodology, and he became very, very good at helping companies make that trip. At that point, he gave it a name, called it the Entrepreneurial Operating System, wrote the book Traction, which introduced EOS to the world. And at that point, companies began to adopt it. So if anybody out there has read Traction, then you know that the tools of EOS are very, very simple. But simple doesn't necessarily mean easy. And one of the things that he noticed is that it really does work a whole lot better if you work with an expert, somebody who's done this before, hopefully many times. The problem was there was only one expert, and it was Gino. So Gino founded an organization called EOS Worldwide. And EOS Worldwide is a voluntary community of successful entrepreneurs. We collaborate together to help other entrepreneurs get everything they want to get out of their business. So what Gino did is he brought in a handful of people, and he taught those people how to implement EOS exactly the way he did it. That handful of people then brought in dozens and taught them. The dozens are now teaching hundreds. So I'm part of that third wave. When I joined EOS Worldwide, there were about 150 of us worldwide. There's now over 350 who are implementing EOS Worldwide. And what we like to say is that we provide companies three things, and we refer to those as vision, traction, and healthy. So vision is about getting the leaders of the organization on the same page with exactly where the organization is going and exactly how it's going to get there. Teaching those leaders the tools they need to execute, that's traction, so that they can execute with discipline and accountability to make the vision real. And the third is to help bring them together as a healthy, functional, cohesive leadership team. Because a lot of times they're not. Business leaders aren't necessarily the best team players. So as we get the vision, traction, healthy together with the leadership team, we then teach them how to cascade that down to the rest of the organization and eventually get to the point where everybody in the organization is crystal clear where the business is going, how it's going to get there. Everybody's executing, being held accountable, and the entire organization moves forward as a cohesive whole, all focused on the greater good. So that's really what this organization I'm part of is about. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce you to EOS at a high level, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper on an area that I think is going to be of particular interest to the crowd here today. So what you're about to see is an excerpt. I'm going to try to keep this to about 10 or 15 minutes about EOS, and this is pulled out of a 90-minute workshop that I do. That's typically my first introduction to a company as they're trying to evaluate yes or no, is EOS something that's going to help them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you first at a high level to the EOS model. And the EOS model comes out of, I mentioned before that as Gino was building this, there were certain patterns he noticed. One of them is that every executive has 150 things up in the air all at the same time. And those 150 things really boil down to just 6 key components of the business. And if you get really, really good at managing each of these 6 key components of the business and managing them in conjunction with each other, then all those 150 things just kind of fall into place. So I'm going to introduce to you what those 6 key components are. The first is vision. And vision in EOS is about alignment. It's not about coming up with brilliant new ideas nobody's ever thought of before. It's just about alignment. It's about getting the leadership team aligned around where you're going and how you're going to get there. And the way we do that is just by answering 8 simple questions. And by getting the leadership team to agree on the answer to 8 questions, that's where the alignment comes from. As I like to say, no light between your shoulders. From there, we cascade it down to the rest of the organization so that everybody's crystal clear where you're going, how you're going to get there. The second component is people, because everybody knows you can't have a great business unless you have a great team. The challenge is, how do you know for your organization what it is to have a great team? Because the definition of a great team is different for every single organization. So how do you cut to the heart of exactly what it means to have great people? So there's 2 tools I'm going to share that get you there. The third thing is data. In fast-moving entrepreneurial organizations, decisions tend to get made based upon a bunch of subjective stuff. It's agendas and egos and the loudest voice, the squeakiest wheel, what's the customer that complained most recently. The way you cut through all that subjective stuff is you focus in on a specific set of data that really gives you a pulse of what's going on in your business. And you just continue to keep an eye on that business, that data, and that becomes a pulse on your business. Now, if I stop here, and we've just done these first 3 things. We've got a clear vision. Everybody knows where you're going, how you're going to get there. You've got a great team of people committed to making it happen. And you've got data that really gives you a pulse of what's going on in your business. This amazing thing happens. And that is that all of your issues, the challenges, the barriers, the things that are going to slow you down or trip you up on your way to achieving your vision, they stick out like a sore thumb. Because what I just described is this open, honest, transparent organization. So now the next question becomes, now that we're identifying and smoking out those issues, what do we do with those? And that's what we refer to as the issues trap. And this is about capturing those issues, a little bit of courage here, because you can't solve the problems you're not willing to admit to. Capturing those issues, prioritizing them, and addressing them in a way that makes them go away forever. And the way you make an issue go away forever is you attack it at the root. And there's tools that we use to teach teams exactly how to do that. Now, when I talk about attacking issues at the root, it's not going to come as a shocker if I tell you that they tend to lie in two areas. One is people, and the other is systems and processes. So the fifth component is the process component. And this is about taking a very elegant entrepreneurial 20/80 approach to documenting processes so that it's crystal clear to everybody how work gets done. And what that does is, once we get people to follow those processes, which is a trick in and of itself, then the business becomes more consistent, more predictable, more reliable. It becomes more scalable, more manageable, because when you push things down in the organization, they don't bubble back up again. It becomes more productive, more profitable, and frankly, more fun, because you're getting rid of a lot of friction when you do that. So the sixth component is the traction component. And this is about making steady progress week after week, quarter after quarter, year after year to achieve your vision. And what we're talking about here is teaching first the leadership team, but ultimately pushing it down to the entire organization so that everybody is executing. This is really where the magic happens. Reality is, it's pretty hard to find a business that doesn't have some kind of vision. It's also hard to find a business that hits their marks quarter after quarter, year after year after year after year, until that vision is attained. That ability to achieve the vision through traction, that is the biggest difference between those 5% of great companies and the 95%. Vision without traction is hallucination. So that's what we need to do in order to make that journey from wherever we are to becoming a great business, is through traction. So that's the overview of the model. And again, what I typically do in our 90-minute workshop, which obviously we don't have time for today, is that we go deep into each one of these and describe exactly what it is that we do and all the tool set that we use to help companies make this trip. What I am going to do here is I'm going to dive into one of these, and that is the people piece, because that's the piece that I think is most interesting to the people here and most relevant, given that, you know, Center for Victory and Predictive Index is all about the people piece. So the question becomes, how do we define what it means to have a great team? Because the definition of a great team is different for every single organization. So the answer that we have is actually very simple. It's putting the right people in the right seats. Nothing brilliant there, nothing new there. That's right out of, if you read Jim Collins' Good to Great, which has been around about 20 years, he says it's about getting the right people on the bus, getting the right people in the right seats. However, he doesn't tell us, how do you gauge, how can you objectively tell whether you've got the right people in the organization? And the definition of right people is these are the people who fit your culture. So how do you know, how can you objectively assess whether you got the right people? And how do you objectively assess whether they're in the right seats? So I'm going to share with you one of the tools in the EOS toolbox, and we call this tool the People Analyzer. And I'm going to begin by talking about how we assess whether we got the right people, that is, the people who fit our culture. So the way this tool works, it's very powerful, but it's very simple. First thing we do is we put the names of our people down the side, and then across the top, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about culture. Now, I mentioned before that in Vision, there's 8 questions that we answer to provide that alignment for the leadership team. The very first one of those questions is about culture. And what we talk about is we call those core values. In an EOS, what core values are is they're a bulletized representation of what is unique about your culture. It's the special sauce of your culture, or as I like to say, how do your people behave when they are at their best? So we go through a very interesting and intricate discovery process to come to an answer and summarize it with 3 to 7 bullets that summarize what's special about your culture. So what we do is we take those aspects, we call the core values, and we put those across the top. And now what we're going to do is we're simply going to rate each of our people against each of those core values and find out how they stack up. And the rating system we use is very simple. We call it plus, plus minus, minus. So only 3 ratings. The definition of a plus is this is somebody that we can trust to live up to that core value all the time. Now, all the time doesn't mean 100%. That's everybody has a bad day, 80% plus. If this is somebody that I believe lives up to this core value 80% of the time or more, then they're a plus on that core value. Well, if they're not 80%, but they still live up to that core value most of the time, 60, 70%, then they're a plus minus. But if this is somebody that I'm just going, I just can't trust this person, rely on them to live up to this core value most of the time, then they're a minus on that core value. What we're going to do is we're going to work our way across and rate our people on this scale, plus, plus, minus, minus, as to how they stack up against our culture. So we're going to start with Sally Jones. And Sally is pluses across the board. We love her. She is absolutely the right person for this organization. She fits every one of our core values to a T. The next guy, John Smith, not so much. He doesn't actually live up to any of our core values. So this is somebody who we really don't want on our team. He doesn't fit our culture. He's really not fitting in. He may even be a little bit toxic out there in the organization. So this is somebody who's just the wrong person for our organization. We probably need to give him the opportunity to go find an organization who's a better fit. Now, George, on the other hand, George is a combination. So he's got 3 pluses and 2 plus minuses. So the question becomes, how good does somebody need to be able to play on this team? How do we say whether or not someone fits our culture looking across all these core values? Because obviously we'd love everybody to be like Sally, pluses across the board. That's not realistic. So what we do is we have to make a decision, and we refer to that decision as the bar. So as we're setting this all up and setting our core values, we're going to decide how good does somebody need to be in order to play on this team. Our rule of thumb, every organization gets to decide for themselves, but our rule of thumb is that to play on this team, you've got to be a plus on at least half of your core values. 1 minus is a deal killer. So in George's case, he's got 3 pluses, 2 plus minuses. He's over the bar, he fits. Now, if we'd have done this and he's got, 2 pluses, 3 plus minuses, we got to have a conversation with George and say, listen, you're really not adhering to the culture. You're going to have to figure out a way to improve yourself on one of these core values, or you can't play on this team. And again, 4 pluses, 1 minus, you better get that minus to a plus minus, or you can't play on the team. So that's how we gauge whether someone is the right person in a pretty objective way, whether or not they fit your culture. The second one, are they in the right seat? This is harder, because what every organization says is I have an open seat, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the right butt to put in that seat. But the reality is what we then do is we shape the seat to fit the butt. So whenever we go in and say, well, tell me what you need out of the leader of your sales organization, and they go, oh, that's Ann. Let me tell you what Ann does. Didn't ask you what Ann does. I ask you what you need out of the seat, which may or may not be what Ann does. So what we need to do is we take an approach we call structure before people. We take people out of it. And the first thing we need to do is we need to decide what are the right seats for this organization. So at the leadership team level, we may say we have a seat for sales and marketing, a seat for operations, a seat for finance. We may decide that sales and marketing, that's 2 seats. We may decide we need to add an HR seat. So we're going to define what are the right seats for this organization. Once we define the seats, again, the people are out of the conversation, we now need to say, what are we going to hold those people accountable for? So if we go to our sales seat, well, we're going to need them to build and manage a sales team. We're going to need them to build and oversee a sales process. We're going to hold them accountable for hitting quota. And just to get a leading indicator in there, let's say that we also want to hold them accountable for weighted pipeline. So those are the 4 things we're going to hold that seat accountable for. Only then can we go back and say, who fits this seat? And now Ann raises her hand and says, well, I guess that's me. So now to assess whether somebody fits that seat, 3 things must be true. They must get it, they must want it, and they must have the capacity to do it. So let me describe what those mean. Get it is this is just who they are. They just fundamentally understand it. They're just wired to do that. This is their unique God-given ability. So we've all known people who are just born to be salespeople, or born to be accountants, or born to be engineers. You don't need to explain the basics. They just get it. So that's what get it is. Want it is they need to be excited about doing this job. You may have somebody who was just born to be an engineer, but they've been an engineer for 37 years and they're just sick of it. They don't want to do it anymore. And then the third is capacity, and that is they can live up to the requirements of the job from a quality standpoint, given the resources that they're given, including time. So on this, the bar is not negotiable. Got to be 3 yeses. They've got to get it, want it, have the capacity to do it. So the tool we use to capture the seats and the accountability, we refer to as an accountability chart. And there's much more I could go into. For time, we won't. But the idea is that these two things, your core values, right person, your accountability chart, defining the seats, and then making sure people GWC, that becomes a verb, the seat that they're in, that's how we gauge whether we got the right people in the right seat. And the goal for every organization is to get to the point where everybody in the organization, you got 40 people, 40 out of 40, fit your culture, right people, and GWC their seat. They're in the right seat. So the goal is to get to 100% of your people in the right seat. Now, this was a very high level view of the people piece. Again, we go into much more detail in this in the full workshop. My contact information is coming up if anybody's interested. So what I want to do is first I'm going to put that up, but while I do, I want to speak just a little bit to Predictive Index. So I've been working with Center for Victory now for a little over a year, working with them on their EOS implementation, and I've actually introduced Eric into a few companies. I used Predictive Index when I was running my IT services company, and Predictive Index is a great tool for gauging GWC. And that tool we just looked at, this People Analyzer, is a tool I use with the clients I work with, where we'll go through, and every once in a while there'll just be a people issue, and we're just not sure what's going on. And in about 5 minutes, we go through this process, and it just pinpoints us to where the issue is. When you've got a GWC issue, Predictive Index gives you that next level of detail down that can help you understand where that fits. In addition, as you're looking to bring more people in the organization, we talk about how you hire for culture and tools that we teach around that as part of EOS. Predictive Index is a great tool for helping us determine whether this person is likely to get it, want it, have the capacity to do it in their seat. So Eric, I want to turn it back over to you and ask the question. Again, anybody wants more information about any of this, there's my contact information. But Eric, anything that you'd like to add about what I just said about how Predictive Index dovetails with what I'm talking about here in terms of getting the right people in the right seats?
Absolutely. For a leader, I mean, it's really getting those core values down, but that, you know, that GWC, I mean, that's been huge even for us. And we're, we are embedded with people, right? That's what we do. But to define that for yourself, especially if you're a leader inside of a company, to understand that, because those are some of the things that you want to hire from, fire from, review, reward, recognize. And I know Paul's probably going to talk about that too when we create those stories. But it's very important to understand those things and to have something solid, as you said earlier, Michael, that we can track that with. It's not just about having a bad day towards somebody and we say, well, they don't fit. Well, just because you had a bad day or you don't like them or whatever, now you have a marker for that, and then everybody marches towards that marker, and that's what really, really solidifies that culture.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, as I switch over to Paul here, Michael, the one question you can answer while I'm making this switch, and that's how's EOS really helped companies through this time where we've had COVID?
So EOS is a tool set. And what I've heard over and over and over from everybody, pretty much every client that I work with, is that this tool set has served them well by virtue of the fact that they've got the problem-solving tools, by virtue of the fact that they've got the structure for how our organization is going to be built, the fact that they've got this this vision, the fact that they've got a scorecard where they're looking at data, the fact that they've got the meeting pulses, we call it, where they're getting in these sessions on a weekly basis and staying on top of things, has really allowed them to move forward. I heard that from a client who I've been working with for only a matter of weeks, who sent me an email and said, when the everything got shut down, and he said, already these tools are having a tremendous impact. I had another one I spoke to a couple of weeks ago who said that they were having a conversation themselves in what we call their L10 meeting about how fortunate they were that they started implementing these tools last year, so they had them in place. Another one told me that if this had happened a year ago before they started with EOS, they're not sure what they would have done as a business. They're not sure they would have survived. But because of these tools, they're now in a position where they're not only surviving, they think they're positioned to really thrive as things start to open back up again. So I'll also kind of open it back up to you guys now or later if you, Paul and Eric, want to talk about the experience you've had with EOS as a result of that.
Yeah, I'll let Paul handle that as we jump into, you know, his side really. And again, I've used Paul and his team. They're wonderful. You know, the questions that always come up, Paul, you know, what do you mean by a parable, right?
Right.
And then storytelling, isn't that kind of old fashioned, or doesn't it happen on social media? So walk us through all that. Tell us about WordWrite and why storytelling. Why is it so important, but why now?
Right, sure. So this all connects together, and at our organization, WordWrite, we use the PI, and we are also an EOS company, and we work with Michael. So you're going to see how the people, process, and parables all fit together. And I will plead guilty as the marketing person in the group. I picked the word parables, and yes, usually that describes a specific kind of a story, frequently a biblical story. If you get on the interwebs out there, you'll see there are a lot of discussions about the parables that come particularly from the Christian Bible, the New Testament, stories that Jesus used. So a parable, though, in a broader definition, is a very simple, direct story that teaches a lesson or helps people remember something really, really important. And in a couple of minutes here, we're going to talk about that as we define it as the capital S story. Now, let's talk about whether storytelling is old-fashioned. Yes, it is. The word I prefer to use is ageless, because the very first thing that people learned to do when they started communicating with each other beyond basic needs was to tell stories and to share stories about culture and about motivation and great battles and great leaders and important achievements. Archaeologists can go back and they can see that even before human beings learned how to write stories down, to have a written language, that there were people in societies that had the job of storyteller. Some of you who've joined us today may be familiar with the concept of a talking stick. Maybe when you were a kid, you were in some social organization, maybe the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts, and when you sat around the campfire in a circle and you all got together and you wanted to take turns talking, your leader might have passed a talking stick. Well, guess what? They found talking sticks in archaeological digs going back in societies before the beginning of the written word. And on some of those talking sticks that were somewhat preserved, they found symbols. So if I was a storyteller, even before the advent of the internet or writing, I might have had this talking stick that was passed down to me from the elderly storyteller before me, and I had all these symbols and notes on this stick to remind me of the most important stories. So wow, storytelling is ageless. But guess what? Not only is storytelling the only form of communication that we're built with inside of our brains, going all the way back to the beginning of human history, it's also the form of storytelling that requires no external power source, no batteries required. And in this 21st century, where depending upon what study you look at, we're bombarded on a daily basis by between 6,000 and 10,000 message inputs, road signs, text messages, notifications on our phone, on our computer. And by the way, to Eric's point at the very beginning of today's webinar, it's only worse in the age of COVID. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm being bombarded by notifications about what's happening in the world, and certainly the very sad events of the last 2 weeks after the George Floyd death. I mean, it's only added another level of that. So storytelling is ageless, but it is also perfectly designed for the advent of the 21st century, and that includes social media. So this is a little bit about WordWrite. Now, this is very important. One of the tools that Michael did not talk about is something that's kind of like a roadmap for a company throughout its progress as it grows and puts in place strong processes and people. And that's called the VTO, the Vision Traction Organizer. And this is taken directly from WordWrite's Vision Traction Organizer. What is our purpose as an organization? And as you kind of guessed, it's all about authentic stories. And why do we focus on stories? Because stories move hearts and minds, and as a result, they inspire action. And when you think about organizations that you're part of, or perhaps that you lead, that's what you want to do. You want to move people to do things, whether you're talking about your employees, or you're talking about customers or partners or whatever. Now, related to that, we've developed something we call our niche. And that is, as Eric is advancing here, this is our definition of the stories we care about. And I'm going to talk on the next slide about this, but let me just quickly recap this for you. At WordWrite, what we do with our clients is we uncover, develop, and then share an organization's capital S story. Now, there are stories and there are stories. In the old days, and yes, I'm probably older than Michael. I know I'm definitely older than Eric. Eric is smiling at me. I don't know if he's got his camera on right now. So I remember when it was possible to say, today's story is tomorrow's lining for the birdcage. But nobody reads stories in print anymore. They read them on their phones. So let's put it this way. Today's story is tomorrow's email trash bin, or the lost part of the Twitter feed that you'll never get back. A capital S story is entirely different. It's the story above all other stories. That's why we give it a capital S. It's the story that answers why someone would want to partner with you, work for you, do business with you, work for you, invest in you, or if you're a nonprofit, donate to you. So on the next slide, we'll just give you a little bit more insight into what that means. So we often say that before your organization had a brand, you had a story. That story is unique to you. It's your capital S story. And that story should drive whatever brand you're presenting to the marketplace of ideas, whether you're hiring or promoting or coaching or selling or whatever audience you're trying to reach. We believe in this so strongly that over the last 10 years at our company, we've developed a trademark process called story crafting that we use to uncover this capital S story. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. One of the critical tools that we use are what we call brand archetypes. And it might be a little bit hard for those of you participating in the webinar to see this, but essentially, most people who study classic story types and archetypes agree there are about a dozen story archetypes that are most common. And I'll give you an example. If I tell you that your company's story is a David and Goliath story, you don't have to be a biblical scholar to understand that your company is the underdog taking on the giant in the workplace or in the marketplace of ideas. And this is simply an illustration here in the lower right corner of the slide of many of the archetypes that you might see. If any of those interest you and we have time in the Q&A, we can talk about those. So I believe I only have one more slide there, Eric.
No,
That's all you got there? Okay, good. Excellent. Okay, so let me just talk about a few things that relate to what we've talked about so far with Michael, and that Eric's going to talk about in a minute here. So one of the things that we've learned in doing our story crafting process with clients is the importance of tying that story to every single audience that you want to attract. So as you can see here in the 4 bullets, it's the people who work for you as well. And I just want to give you a client example, and it's the Center for Victory. Most of you who are participating in the webinar today know the Center for Victory. Many of you are clients and have worked with Eric and his team. So a few years ago, Eric came to us and he was working on teasing what turned out to be his capital S story out in a way that he could market the Center for Victory more clearly. And we went through this process of developing archetypes and story crafting for the Center for Victory. What we learned through that process is that the Center for Victory's archetype is something we call the champion. Now, not the champion is I won the race, but the champion is the person who makes it possible for you to win the race. So if you're a Center for Victory client, if you think about that a little bit, and you think about the way that Eric and his team work with you, using the Predictive Index and other tools that they have at their command, what they're doing is helping you, your leaders, your organization achieve its greatest possible success. So if you've looked at any of the social media promotion for this webinar today, you've seen what our story crafting process ultimately looked like for the Center for Victory. You might remember that there's a logo and that it's a leaf with a thumbprint in it. That is a visual representation of the concept of the champion making it possible for you to achieve your greatest degree of success. The thumbprint, it's unique to you. The leaf symbolizes growth. And we also put together a tagline, your champion for success, which says it right there. Now, frequently when we work with a client, we identify their archetype, you're not going to find that plastered all over everything. Another client example I often use is an accounting firm here in town, and it turns out that their archetype is the sage, which is represented in this little graphic here. Well, first of all, I love accountants, and we love this client in particular, but they don't walk around the earth saying, "Hi, I'm a sage. How can I help you?" So the archetype wound up resulting in a tagline, an identity, a logo, et cetera, et cetera. Their tagline is a higher grade of accounting. Okay, so you can get a couple of examples there of how this plays out. Unfortunately, what most marketing agencies do is they start with the cutesy tagline and they start with the logo and the colors, and it doesn't have anything to do with who you are as an organization. And the problem with that is that your clients, your customers, your employees, they have a view of who you are. And it has nothing to do with your tagline and nothing to do with the colors in your logo. It has everything to do with the character and the nature of your organization. And that is your capital S story. So this relates directly to what Eric's going to talk about now about the predictive index and about people, because in our own organization, one of the things we've done is we've taken our own story and our own archetype. We are the explorer archetype, which is sometimes the guide or the navigator, depending upon which version of the 12 archetypes you're looking at. And we've taken the EOS VTO and we've mapped out our core values: curiosity, authenticity, intellectual curiosity. I think I might have repeated that. Oh, collaborative, authentic, intellectually curious, resourceful, and optimistic. These are all core values that represent who a word writer, as we call ourselves, might be. They're the embodiment of the explorer archetype. And when we use the PI and we design job postings, when we look for people, guess what, folks? Everything about that capital S story is translated into the predictive index process so that we find the right people. And guess what? In terms of growing the company and applying EOS to WordWrite, everything about that capital S story is translated into how we work to develop the people, the processes to grow the company. And Eric, I'll leave it there so that we can move on.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul and Michael. That was a great overview by both of you. I do have some questions for you, and if folks have questions, you can put it in the chat there, and we'll get to it. Paul, same question as I asked Michael. Through this whole COVID, how has WordWrite really helped companies through the past few months? What are you seeing? And what should we take on as a priority as we continue to go through the times that we're going through right now?
That's a great question, Eric. And so, all of us as leaders in organizations and all of our organizations find ourselves in a crisis not of our own making. And crisis really puts the test to who and what you are as an organization. So one of the things that we talk about a lot at our firm, and we actually do a lot of crisis communication work. In any given year, we handle about 12 major crises, 2 that are all over the news and 10 that you never hear about. And so one of the things that we keep talking about with our clients is going back to your story. In times of crisis, if you think about what most of us know, being in a car accident or a fire, or, a lot of times you'll see these stories in the newspaper where somebody's changing the oil in their car and it falls off the jack, and some small person lifts the car off of them, right? It's when you're in a crisis situation, there's incredible stress put on you, and your brain it tends to regress. So when that happens, if you've done a good job of articulating your capital S story and it's well known, you're going to be in better shape. In a crisis like this, there's typically 3 phases that we see. One is to stop the bleeding. That's what happens immediately. Think of a medical situation. And then you have to win hearts and minds. And if you think about, if you run an organization or you're a leader in an organization that deals with the public, that's right where you are right now. Restaurants, businesses that serve the public are going to open back up right now, right? Next week. So how are they going to convince the people that they work with, employees, their customers, their vendors, et cetera, that they're an okay organization and that it's okay to visit their establishment? A really great capital S story, and articulating that well right now will get that job done.
Okay, here's a question probably more geared towards Paul, but I think you might be able to weigh in on this, Michael, just because of, again, I've worked with both of you, and Paul, you and I, man, we go way back, like into the mid 2000s there. We've known each other for a while, and you really helped create that story. And then when we started working with Michael, it was really defining what it is that we're looking at. What do we want? What do we want to reinforce? What's important to us with our core values? That was huge. But here's the question. It's a really good question. Do you see an organization's story typically coming from a specific actual situation, or is it normally a mashup of multiple stories put together?
Well, I guess I'll start. So think of an organization's story like a book. Why a book? Because a book has chapters, and every organization goes through different life cycle stages. And I'm sure Michael will have something to share about this in a second. So, in the early chapter, maybe it's all about the founder and the people who start the organization. And then as the organization grows, the story shifts. And maybe in year 5 of the organization, a different product or service really takes off. And that's yet another chapter. So it's more, the word mashup is a good one, but think of it more as an evolution. Your story evolves over time. An example I'll often use is Apple. In the beginning, it was Apple Computer.
Mhm.
Today, Apple is much more than just a computer company, but it's still Apple.
If you don't have any comment, Michael, we do have another question for you.
Okay.
All right, so let me ask you this one. Another good question. Can you expand a little bit on the definition of what get it means? Seems like it could overlap with an assessment of their alignment with our values.
So the assessment of the values really is around what we call the right person. And that's that piece of the people analyzer. Get it has to do with the content of the job. And there is a tendency sometimes to see a little bit of bleed over there. But as you start getting more and more comfortable with these ideas of what these are and the way that you gauge right person versus right seat, the line actually becomes a little bit more distinct than you might think it'd be. Get it is really about their thought process in their seat, in their job. You find yourself needing to explain to them things that you think that they probably ought to figure out themselves. That's really what Get It's about. It's just about their wiring. Everybody has that unique God-given ability, that thing that they're designed to do. That's what Get It's all about. And ideally, what you want, if you can imagine every single person in your organization doing what they love to do, what they were born to do, that's the ideal in terms of getting the right people in the right seats.
Yeah. Any other questions coming in? Okay. All right. Any parting words from you guys? This has been good. Just if you would each just sum up again what we talked about, how it overlaps. But there is, when you talk about talent optimization, I guess the one last thing I'd like both of you to speak on is this whole idea of, because stories reinforce this whole process, and of EOS reinforces this with the people analyzer. It's that thing on hire, fire, review, reward, and recognize, and how that is so important to make sure that you hammer down on inside the company, especially in times like this, is we're getting rid of people. Maybe we're getting a little leaner and we need to get a little leaner. Or as we bring people back on, who do we bring back on? So can each of you speak to that a little bit before we end the webinar here, please?
Sure.
Yeah, so let me speak to that first, because there's a couple things that Paul talked about in his presentation that really directly linked to some of the ways that these things do dovetail. The idea of the storytelling along with EOS is where Paul started the conversation, as he talked about his purpose and his niche. That's at the very beginning, I talked about vision is 8 questions. The first question is, what is your core values, which Paul also spoke to. Second is, what is your core focus? We like to say is those 2 things are the soul of your company. So the chapters may change, a paragraph here or there in the story may change, but that common theme, that thing that doesn't change over time, that's the soul of your company. And again, I love the fact that Paul started by sharing with you what their core focus is, that purpose that they've got, and that niche, that thing that they do better than everybody, and their core values, because that is very, very much foundational in your company's story. If you're a really aligned, congruent, healthy company, you're going to find that the arc of your story aligns perfectly with what it is that you love to do, the thing that really gets you out of bed in the morning, and that thing that you're great at. So Paul, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, Michael, that's great. That's an excellent summation. And what I would just say is, you described it as the soul of the company. That capital S story is baked into the soul of your organization. And as one of the questions suggested during the webinar today, it does evolve over time, but it's still that same basic story. It's a touchstone. And so, Eric, to your point, whether you're growing and you're hiring, or you're looking to find a new role for somebody, it's the person who really embodies that story who's going to be the high achiever and the high performer in your organization. And like Michael said, when he was talking about EOS, what makes a great employee in a specific organization, organization A versus organization B, might be entirely different. But knowing what that is and measuring people against that is critically important. especially in a time like this.
Okay, well, good. I appreciate both of you being on. I hope this has been worthwhile for those of you that have participated. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it. We know you could be doing other things. Our contact for each of us are up there, Michael, Paul, and myself. This recording will be put up. It'll probably be put up tomorrow. It'll be edited, so you'll have access to it, so you can go back over and watch it again, but we'll send it out. If you got an email about this, you'll get an email that it's up, and you can just share it with anybody or rewatch it, whatever you need to do. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of us now. So Michael's there, Michael at FreeBridgeInc.com, Paul at paul.furiga at WordWritePR.com, and myself, Eric, at CenterForVictory.com. Thanks for tuning in. We hope to see you all back on our next webinar. Thanks again, Michael.